Welcome to the debate. We are looking at a document today that is frankly explosive. It doesn't just ask us to rethink history, it demands we redraw the moral map of the world. We are analyzing the position paper from January 16th, 2026 by Jimma Ma'ad Dagan, titled Black African Global Holocaust, Knowledge They Do Not Want You to Know. Now, usually when we talk about this history, we get these sanitized terms like trade or labor. This text just rejects that. It argues that the last millennium of Black African history wasn't a collection of bad events, but a singular, intentional, and continuous global atrocity.
It is a text that absolutely refuses to blink. It challenges the reader to look at a massive span of time. We are talking the Atlantic, the Sahara, and the Indian Ocean trade routes, and see them not as separate economic systems, but as one monolithic crime. And that, right there, sets up the tension we have to navigate today. Is this history best understood as a single global Holocaust that requires a unified material response? Or does grouping, 1,000 years of very different empires and systems into one total framework actually risk oversimplifying history and making the reconciliation the author wants maybe impossible to achieve?
And the stakes are incredibly high, because this isn't just about the past. The source material posits that the wealth disparities, the political instability, the chaos we see today in 2026, these aren't accidents. They're the calculated outcomes of the very system described in the paper. So my position is that the author is correct. This was a unique, intentional global atrocity, a global Holocaust. And until we admit that and move toward material reparations, we are just pretending to do justice.
And I'm approaching this from the perspective of, let's call it historical precision. I agree the atrocities are undeniable, of course, but I believe the framework of a monolithic global crime, and specifically the text pivot from individual guilt to this broad idea of institutional responsibility, it creates a kind of fog. I worry that the path to true reconciliation gets lost when we move from establishing hard historical truths to demanding a global restructuring that might be politically impossible to implement.
Okay, so let's get into the advocate's position, which really mirrors the core of Jimma Ma'at Dagan's paper. The text starts by stripping away the euphemisms. It argues that what happened to Black Africans cannot be called labor exploitation. It identifies it as the deliberate construction of a racial caste system. I mean, we aren't just talking about bad working conditions here. We are talking about chattel slavery, forced removal across 3 different ocean systems, and then subsequent colonization. The author is very specific. This system was legalized, racialized, transnational, and sustained by governments and religious authorities.
The scope is just massive.
It has to be. And the text argues that minimizing or fragmenting this history constitutes historical amnesia. Think about how we usually learn this. We treat the American South as one story, the Belgian Congo as another, darker story, the Arab slave trade is a third, totally unrelated story. The text says, no, that misses the forest for the trees. This was a coordinated dehumanization where blackness itself was defined as a permanent, inheritable condition of enslavement. If you deny that unified framework, you are actually continuing the harm because you're refusing to see the scale of the crime.
I agree that historical amnesia is a poison. We cannot sanitize the past. However, this consolidation of diverse events spanning 400 to 1,000 years into a single global Holocaust is, I think, analytically risky. I am particularly struck by the shift in focus in Section 6, the one titled "This is not about individual guilt."
That is the pivot point of the entire document.
It is. The argument shifts from establishing factual truth, which we absolutely need, to demanding institutional accountability and material repair. The text explicitly says it's not looking for individual blame, but then it demands mandatory material reparations for centuries-old actions. And that jump, to me, requires a really rigorous examination of feasibility. Furthermore, I have concerns about the text's definition of blackness. Well, yes, it's factually based on the slave codes of the time. Framing Black identity permanently within the context of a global Holocaust is, well, it's heavy. We want to acknowledge the trauma without cementing identity solely in that trauma.
See, I'd argue the text isn't cementing identity in trauma, it's exposing the system that tried to. But let's look at the evidence for why this deserves the title Global Holocaust. The document makes a bold claim in Section 4, calling this an atrocity of unusual depth.
It lists 5 specific factors for that.
Right. Permanence of status, racialization, scale and duration, total systems control, and post-abolition continuity. And I want to zero in on total systems control. The text argues that governments didn't just look the other way, they regulated African movement, families, bodies, labor, and identity. This wasn't just economic, it was total domination. When you look at the slave codes, the royal decrees, the colonial laws, the state apparatus was entirely designed to suppress a specific group of people based on race.
Okay, but here is where I struggle with the global application of that total systems control. The text explicitly groups Middle Eastern states and empires that maintained African slavery for a millennium alongside the American colonial states. But if we look at the history, the actual mechanisms of slavery in, say, the Ottoman Empire or under various caliphates were distinct from the chattel slavery of the American South. In many Middle Eastern systems, enslaved people could sometimes rise in military ranks. They could gain manumission, freedom, and integrate. It was brutal, yes, but it wasn't the once a slave, always a slave racial caste of the American South. So by grouping them under one global Holocaust umbrella, don't we obscure those specific mechanisms?
That distinction might exist in the technical details, but the text argues it is irrelevant to the morality and the racial outcome. If you look at Section 3, who was involved, it explicitly lists Middle Eastern states and empires that maintained African slavery for centuries. The unifying factor, according to the author, isn't the specific daily job of the enslaved person, whether they were a soldier or a field hand. The unifying factor is the racialization and the scale. Whether it was the trans-Saharan trade or the transatlantic trade, the commodity was the black African body. The text argues that because these systems operated across continents, religions, monarchies, republics, and empires, a global framework is the only accurate way to view it. You can't separate the insurers in London from the plantation owners in Virginia or the captors in the Indian Ocean. They were all interconnected gears in the same global engine.
The economic interconnection is clear, I grant you that. But let's look at point 5 in section IV, post-abolition continuity. The text equates convict leasing, sharecropping, and colonial rule directly with the previous epochs of slavery. It says abolition often ended legal ownership, not exploitation. And while I agree that exploitation continued, equating sharecropping directly with the legal status of chattel slavery under the header of a continuous Holocaust, it risks losing legal nuance. I mean, there is a fundamental difference between being property by law, a thing to be bought and sold, and being an exploited worker in a deeply unfair system.
But is there a difference in the lived experience or just in the paperwork? The document states that under convict leasing and sharecropping, the domination and extraction remained. So if a law changes on paper, but the person is still forced to labor without profit, still subject to racial terror and segregation, which the text lists, then the system hasn't really changed, it is just mutated. The author's point is that the global Holocaust didn't just end with a signature on a piece of paper. It continued because the intent to exploit black labor remained. The text calls this post-abolition continuity. It's arguing that the Holocaust didn't stop, it just changed its management strategies.
Which brings us directly to the question of who holds that intent and who pays for it. This is our second core topic: institutional responsibility versus individual guilt. Section V is quite explicit about this. This black position paper does not seek individual blame.
Exactly. And this is, to me, the most sophisticated part of the argument. It moves the conversation away from that paralyzing dynamic where people get defensive and say, well, I never owned slaves. The text says, we know. We aren't talking to you. We are talking to the entities that still exist: nations, corporations, religious bodies, and educational systems. The argument is that these institutions have a continuous life. A corporation that insured slave ships in 1750 and exists today still holds the capital generated from that act. It doesn't matter who the CEO is today, the entity profited.
This is where I struggle with the philosophical application. The text says, yes, responsibility remains, but how can an institution be held morally accountable if the individuals within it, the current employees, the current citizens, are absolved of individual blame? An institution is effectively an abstraction. If you find a corporation or a nation today, you are effectively penalizing the current shareholders or taxpayers who, by the text's own admission, are not individually guilty. Doesn't this conceptual abstraction make accountability almost impossible to enforce? You're punishing the son for the sins of the father, but you're calling it institutional responsibility.
Not at all.
The text counters this by focusing on the legal framework. It says laws and doctrines were written to make it legal and intentional. Since institutions created that framework, the slave codes, the royal decrees, the corporate charters, the institutions owe the debt. It's exactly like corporate liability in a lawsuit today. If a chemical company polluted a river 50 years ago, the current management is responsible for the cleanup. They don't get to say, well, the guy who poured the chemicals is dead. No, the company accounts are liable. The pollution here, as the text argues, is the stolen labor, stolen land, stolen lives. The debt is on the books.
Corporate liability is one thing. We have laws for that. But the text goes much further. It implicates religious and imperial institutions that sanctioned enslavement through doctrine. So if the argument is that religious dogma sanctioned enslavement, and the text says it was supported by their religious dogma and gods, is the text demanding a theological reformation as part of reparations? Are we asking the church or Islamic authorities to not just apologize, but to fundamentally alter their doctrinal history? That seems like a much, much taller order than a corporate fine.
I think the text suggests that truth requires admission. If a religious institution claimed moral authority while sanctioning a racial caste system, then yes, that authority is compromised until they admit, as the text says, yes, this happened. It's not about rewriting the Bible or the Quran, but about acknowledging how those texts were weaponized. The author is asking for institutional honesty. You can't preach justice on Sunday if your endowment is built on the bones of the enslaved.
Institutional honesty is a noble goal, and one I think most people would support. But the document doesn't stop at honesty. It moves to our third and perhaps most contentious topic, the necessity of material reparations.
It does, and boldly so. Section 7 states it clearly. Factual truth alone is not enough. The author argues that reconciliation is literally impossible without reparations. The list of what was stolen is comprehensive: labor, land, lives, futures, and wealth. My position is that you cannot rob a people for centuries and then just say, I'm sorry, we're good now.
Okay, but I have to push back on the transition from truth to material repair. The text lists formal acknowledgement and accurate education as requirements, and I believe those are achievable and essential. However, restorative justice in the form of material wealth transfer is distinct. The text claims reparations are the logical, ethical, economic, and legal response. But how does one execute a reparations plan that involves European powers, American states, and Middle Eastern empires all simultaneously?
The complexity of the execution doesn't negate the validity of the debt. The text argues that reparations aren't charity, they are justice. If we admit that global wealth disparities are direct outcomes of enslavement and colonization, which is a key argument in Section 5, then the current economic map of the world is a crime scene. To say it's too complicated to fix is to accept the crime. The text insists that reconciliation without repair is symbolic. It implies that apologies without money are insulting. It's like stealing someone's car, crashing it, and then sending them a get-well-soon card.
But let's look at the global aspect of this repair again. I mean, if we are talking about a Black African global Holocaust, are we expecting a coordinated payment plan from the United States, the United Kingdom, Brazil, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Portugal? The geopolitical reality makes this specific demand almost a fantasy. And my concern is that by tying the essential work of accurate education and formal acknowledgement to an unlikely global wealth transfer, we might stall the progress on the truth-telling part. We might get nothing
because we asked for everything.
That sounds like surrender. The author asserts that modern inequality did not appear spontaneously. If we treat the economic disparity as a natural state rather than a theft, we are perpetuating the racial myths the text warns against. The difficulty of the logistics is a challenge for economists and diplomats, sure, but the moral claim that benefits to others were immense and came at the cost of Black African lives is sound. The text calls for restorative justice. That means restoring what was taken. You can't restore a stolen future with a plaque.
That is a powerful phrase, stolen futures, and I agree that a plaque is insufficient. But I do worry that framing it as a Holocaust, a term with very specific historical weight, aimed at such a broad set of actors, might trigger defensiveness rather than engagement. However, I have to concede that the text is incredibly effective at linking the past to the present. The argument that denial continues the harm in Section 5 is, well, it's hard to refute.
Exactly. It says denial serves to undermine Black African humanity. The refusal to engage with the reparations argument is, in the author's view, a refusal to see Black Africans as full humans worthy of justice. If you broke your neighbor's window, you'd pay for it. If you broke a continent, why is the logic different?
It just brings us back to the sheer scale of the allegation. Total systems control. When you view the history through that lens, the debt becomes almost incalculable.
And perhaps that is the point. The debt is so large, it forces a complete reimagining of the global economy.
We are nearing the end of our time, and this document leaves us with no easy answers. It is a heavy text.
It certainly doesn't let anyone off the hook. So let's summarize where we stand. From my perspective, Jim Amat Doggin's paper is a necessary confrontation. It forces us to accept that the Black African global Holocaust is not a metaphor. It is a description of a total system that consumed millions of lives to build the modern world. The text makes it clear. Denial is complicity. We cannot have justice if we don't have the courage to say, yes, this happened, and yes, responsibility remains. The path forward requires material repair, not just words.
And from my perspective, the document provides a powerful, undeniable corrective to historical amnesia. It rightly identifies the continuity of exploitation from the Middle Passage to colonial rule. However, I maintain that while truth is a public responsibility, the specific mechanism of institutional reparations across such a vast, multi-continental time frame remains a complex, perhaps insurmountable implementation challenge. We must educate without distortion, absolutely, but we must also ensure that the path to reconciliation is practical enough to actually happen, rather than getting stalled in global tribunals that may never convene.
It is a debate that strikes at the very foundations of global wealth and power. The source material forces us to ask, if we know the truth, can we afford not to pay the price?
A question every listener needs to consider. We encourage you to read the text, Black African Global Holocaust, to understand the full scope of the arguments regarding total systems control and the demand for repair.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.
Until next time.